In progress.
Hi, and welcome to today's Lunchtime Research Talk. My name's Catherine Hemmelwright, Director of CCA, and every Wednesday in February you can tune in to different talk over lunch with us here at CCA Londonderry, Londonderry, and Ulster University. Over the month, different PhD researchers from the EU will be presenting their research via Zoom in bite-sized talk, followed by the opportunity for you to ask a question. The aim of these short lunchtime talks aim to share the wider world with the wider world, just some of the research that's taking place at Ulster University. This talk will last no more than 30 minutes in total, including time for your questions and a conversation before we wrap up at 1:45. So just going to do some housekeeping. Please mute. Please put your questions in the chat. We're going to not record the Q&A at the end. So at the end, unmute, pop up on the screen, say hi and join in. Okay, just dealing with a tech issue there. So our pilot season has featured presentations from Jane Harkness and Katie McFadden and Vasiliki Stasinaki, and you can see all of their archives on our YouTube channel. Search for CCA Derry Londonderry on YouTube to find it. And today is our final talk of our pilot month by Daire O'Shea. And a huge thank you to Ulster University, especially to Dr. Catherine O'Hara, Dr. Brian Bridges, and Professor Justin McGee, and to our funders, the Arts Council of Northern Ireland, Derry City and Strabane District Council, and Garfield Weston Foundation. So today I am pleased to introduce Daire O'Shea. The Withdrawn Sublime: Can a landscape that is inaccessible to direct experience be truly sublime? In the age of the Anthropocene, we're at the mercy of hyperobjects whose immensity we cannot truly grasp. This research poses a question of whether artistic intervention can be used to provide a sublime experience of the hyperobjects, such as the seafloor, and thus help us confront them. Daire O'Shea is a sculptor, academic, and lecturer whose practice-based research usually manifests in materialist sculptural outputs. His research tends to revolve around speculative, realist, and object-orientated ontologist philosophy and redefining the sublime in the age of the Anthropocene. And with that, welcome, Daire.
Great. That's great. Thanks very much, Catherine. Yeah, that was a good introduction. I was thinking that, and then I remembered that I wrote it myself. I was thinking that was very accurate. So yeah, first of all, I'd just like to thank CCA. It's a great gallery, and I was just saying that I frequent it despite being sort of from Cork. I spent a lot of time up in this neck of the woods, and yeah, so it's a great honor to talk here, and I just want to thank Catherine specifically for this opportunity. So you should be all able to see this is like my first slide here. It says the Withdrawn Sublime in the age of the hyperobject, right? And basically, I suppose for today, like it's great to be able to sort of deliver a talk about research when it's kind of in the making. Like it's really exciting to be talking about the research, especially at this point where the research isn't fully resolved and won't be for a long time. So this is kind of everything is in flux. And kind of with that in mind, I suppose, I think today what we'll talk about, what we'll try and do is take these two concepts here that are in this sort of title slide. So you have the sublime and you have the hyperobject. And ultimately, what we'll kind of hopefully come out with is an understanding of them both, how they both relate to art, and how specifically they're both can be used as frameworks by artists to sort of engage with the maritime, with the ocean, with the sea, with thinking about what this means for us, and how they're both sort of products of their time as well. So we'll be sort of, yeah, so hopefully by the time we kind of come out of this, we'll have teased these out a bit. Great. So first of all, I suppose I'll just do a quick kind of more of an introduction about myself, although there was a lot there already. I just put up some sculptures here in these slides that I've made just so it's less boring, so you can be looking at them. But basically, yeah, so I'm a I'm a sculptor. I usually refer to myself as like a materialist sculptor, and kind of I suppose my background is that I studied sculpture and combined media. I sort of graduated from Limerick School of Art and Design, And then after that, I went and I did a master's in modern and contemporary art history, criticism, and theory, which is a mouthful, but I did that in University College Cork. And I think those two things have really kind of shaped I suppose, the artist that I am today, because in my undergrad, I got really good grounding in sort of materialist making objects and sculptures, and in my postgrad, um, it was all about engaging with ideas. It was, it was purely sort of criticism and theoretical engagement. And so from that, my sort of artistic practice over the last decade or so has consisted of exhibiting in sort of galleries up and down the island of Ireland, and then also writing sort of responses to exhibitions or critiques, and being able to think about sort of artists' work as kind of as a whole, and sort of understand trends within it, which again sort of feeds into my own practice. So if we briefly look at some of these sculptures, like you can see, they're very materialist, sort of formalist, very engaged with industrial materials and crucially processes of industrial production. Like this thing on the left here is like laser cut aluminium. You need a very particular sort of laser cutter to engage with materials like that. It's the same sort of industrial finish that you get from the sheet aluminium or the plate aluminium when you get it out of the factory. And similarly here, this one on the right, it's galvanized pipe. It's all got all the markings of its manufacturing and processes, and some mild steel that's again milled, machined with precision. So it's all about sort of industrial materials and processes. And then we'll just move on and talk about how sort of my work sort of has bridged into this research now for this PhD that I'm undertaking. So if we look at something like this, that was in a Platform Arts in Belfast, this thing on the left here, so it's called Hyundai Tucson, right? And it's the end point of a lot of research into sort of the road networks that sort of cover this island, and sort of the infrastructure that underlies a lot of these things. So like it's made out of Fomex, which is material associated with the making of road signs. It's got milled and laid worked stainless steel to a high mirror finish, and then it's got commercial vehicle paint covering it. So it's using the sort of processes and materials that underline this process. But then if we go to this kind of newer work on the right here, you can see already there's themes coming through. So the Anthropocene, this is kind of a bridge that's linking us into the research that's going now. And this work kind of comes out of, I spent some time with Chagisk, which is like the sort of farming state agency in the Republic. And it's all about, I suppose, this idea that like when you look out the window of your car, right, or whatever, you see nature, quote unquote, we see the natural world, but really usually what we're seeing is fields, and that's as unnatural and as man-made, and everything about it is as unnatural and man-made and managed as the tarmac roads that we're on. So it's about engaging with this idea of like nature is kind of this concept that sort of can be problematic, and I suppose the Anthropocene is this idea that we're in the geological age now that is totally defined by human intervention on the world. So again, you've got this grass growing in the gallery on like it's perennial ryegrass, which is this highly engineered form of grass, and it's in this nitrogen-rich compost, and it has to be artificially kept alive by gallerists, sort of watering it twice a day because the sun is so hot through the windows, etc. So you see that there's kind of this bridge now into thinking about this idea of the Anthropocene, nature, the world outside of us, and problems with that. So that brings us on to the Sublime and the PhD research that we're at. So like the Sublime, we know kind of roughly what it means. We use it in a relatively everyday language. We mean something that's superlatively great, a great experience. But ultimately, philosophically, the Sublime comes back to sort of this book on the left, which is Edmund Burke, 1757, an Irish sort of philosopher. And then pulling on from that, you have Kant, German philosopher in the 1790s, I think, in Critique of Judgment, also brings up the Sublime. So basically, to boil down very simply, Burke's idea of the Sublime is this idea of terror at a remove. So like, let's say you go up to the top of a mountain and you see this vast landscape, and it's so vast and the power of nature is so apparent there that it actually becomes terrifying. But you're safe, right? The landscape isn't going to swallow you up. So it's this idea of terror at a remove, and it's this idea of like that's such an overwhelming feeling that it's this powerful kind of break limit experience that we can have, and it's very associated with nature. People call that sort of the authoritative sublime from Burke's thinking. Kant kind of runs with that, changes it a bit, and interrogates it a bit more. His sublime is often called the mathematical sublime, and he talks about the sublime as this experience when your idea to conceptualize something um, runs up against your kind of understanding of that thing. So like if we can understand infinity as a concept, but we can't actually grasp it, we can't conceptualize it, and there's a jarring sort of mismatch there, and it's from that kind of jarring sort of mismatch between your ability to understand something and your ability to conceptualize it that you get this sublime feeling. Again, this is also associated with like a massive storm at sea, or like again a vista. You know, it's often associated with the natural world. And so what does that mean for artists, this idea of the limit experience of the sublime? Well, if we think about the sort of the sublime is particularly important to the romantic period, artists of the romantic period. So you have like, you know, the great example of Caspar David Friedrich, the German painter, who was really intentionally engaging with ideas of the sublime. And you have here Monk by the Sea. You have this tiny, tiny figure that's seen from the back, sort of embodying ourselves. And then you have this massive vista, this, you know, this sea, this black sea. It's like the Homeric idea of like a wine dark sea. It's so dark, it's almost intoxicating. And you have this vast sky above it. And so these romantic artists were obsessed with this idea of these limit experiences that we have explicitly when we engage in nature, um, in air quotes. And so the whole idea based around this romantic ideal of the sublime was the fact that these artists were using nature as something to project their sort of consciousness onto, and they run up against this limit experience, and that reflects back on us. So nature was used as this away. There was the subject that was the, you know, us, the human, and then the human mind even more explicitly, and then nature as this other, this exterior place that you can sort of project against, and then get a reflection back. And so it was heavily based on this sort of this distinction between nature, the other, and the subjective mind. And this runs right the way through romanticism into sort of all the way into modernism and even high modernism. Like you have here like Yves Klein, you know, really like high kind of modernism. And again, you have this blue, this, you know, this blue associated with the vastness of the sky or the vastness of the sea again, and losing oneself in that. And again, using this sort of vast, deep, deep time and deep canvas and deep space to sort of reflect your own conscious mind against. So again, you have this separation between the self, the subject, and the other, the object. So kind of if we think about this then, why the sea? Why is the sea such a sublime sort of uh, place, a place of all these sublime feelings, and the maritime? Why are these artists so engaged with the maritime? Well, um, if you think about sort of the Romantic period and the beginning of industrialization and modernism and rationalism, you have all of the sort of nature as it is on land is being heavily rationalized. It's being structured. It's being mapped. And you know, it's very rational. You have, you know, the rationalization of time with the railroads, but the sea was this kind of this final frontier space where you were still completely at the mercy of nature. And you know, and that really was what makes the sublime such a good frame to engage with art at the ocean. But as we kind of get sort of through the industrial, even here you can see, like for example, Winslow Homer, the American painter, you know, in 1884 even he begins to start painting these technological interventions in the ocean that sort of begin to rationalize it and make it safer. Like this is a painting of the first use of a breeches buoy to save someone at sea from a shipwreck. So again, you have this idea of like the ocean is becoming rationalized and it's becoming less strange and less of a frontier space. And you know, it begins even here, but it takes a long time to sort of come to its apogee. But if we think about nowadays, so zooming all the way forward to now, suddenly we have so much data and understanding about the seabed, about the sea. We have so many videos. I mean, you know, we've all seen Blue Planet. But we've also seen these like highly edited. If you look at the bottom right, these highly like enhanced images of the ocean and these beautiful corals and, you know, shoals of herrings murmurating and all of this. You know, suddenly we're inundated with information and imagery specifically about the ocean and about its vastness and beauty. But what this does is it sort of is the sublime even something we can achieve now? Now that we have so much information about the ocean, and now that we seem to have every, you know, square inch of it mapped or becoming mapped, and so now you have to ask the question, well, how do artists engage with the maritime now? If the sublime, you know, may not be a useful method, then how can we engage with the maritime? What's a framework we can use? And that's how we get onto this idea of the hyperobject. Okay, so I'm going to describe this hyperobject, and some of it is going to sound very familiar because we've already been over with the sublime. The hyperobject is this idea generated by the philosopher Timothy Morton, and how he describes it is sort of an object or a system that's so vastly sort of distributed in time and space that we cannot sort of comprehend it fully. We can't ever point to one thing and say that's it. So that's very sublime if we think about it that way. He talks about global warming as a hyperobject. Okay, I can go outside and feel the rain in my head, but that's not global warming. Global warming is described as this huge system that's interrelating with many other systems all over the earth over a massive time period. So we can't ever point to one thing and see that. That's very sublime. But where it becomes almost a mirror of the sublime or a strange sort of inversion of it is where he talks about, okay, it's non-local, not in one place, in vast different areas. Atemporal, same, not in one time, vastly distributed over time. But inter-objective, this is where it gets interesting. The hyperobject is an object or a system. So we could also consider the sea as a hyperobject. It's this vast connection of systems and objects and beings all interacting with one another in this kind of mesh. And because it's this thing that's made out of all these interacting objects, systems, beings, rocks, you know, waves, whatever the case, it becomes very viscous then, which is the last thing, because we are also part of this. Okay, we, you know, engage. You know, we drive our cars. That carbon gets pumped into the air, that gets into the clouds, it goes into the sea. We engage in, you know, our plumbing. Ultimately, some of it ends up in the sea. We are one of these interobjective objects. So there is no, it problematizes this idea of the sea, something away, and the human mind as the subject. So now we have this idea that we are actually fully enmeshed in this. And so how do artists engage in this? In the Romantic period, you had the sea and nature as an away, but now we know that that was just a fiction because it's all coming back to haunt us now. So now we're fully engaged and living inside the hyperobject. So if the visual image was something that was used to conjure the sublime, you have this idea, even in poetry, it was conjured through visual images, or the paintings conjured through visual images, and it's all about the vista and the idea of the vast space. The materialism, the material, the object, the physical is how we can engage with the hyperobject. So you have a quote here from Karen Brad. I won't say it, but basically it's all about how knowing and sort of being can't be separated and how we're within the world. So anything we learn is from being as well as knowing. So just this idea of becoming entangled with the hyperobjects, which we already are. And this idea of the materials that we use then as artists. So if I'm an artist and I want to engage with the maritime today, and I'm thinking, well, the sublime may not be the correct, we mightn't even have access to the sublime anymore, given the preponderance of images in our culture. But instead of thinking about engaging through a hyper object, well, then the material that I'm using, the physicality of what I'm creating, of sculptures or of whatever, the material that I'm using is also part of the hyper object. So it's an actor as well, or an actant, as Jane Bennett would say. So you have this idea of, there's a lot of philosophers thinking about this at the moment, in new materialism, speculative realism, object-oriented ontology, but Jane Bennett would be a key sort of person to engage with here. She talks about matter being vibrant, matter being an actor in a systems as well as us. We're actors in a system. We have agency, and objects and, you know, inert stones and rocks and wind also has an element of agency and can be said to be actors. And so it's a collaboration then with material, and developing sort of a material response to these hyperobjects. And so yeah, again, briefly, Stephen Greenblatt, I won't read this out, right, but ultimately he's another theorist, and he talks about the work of art being sort of a play between, or a potential between, a wondrous work of art where I go and see the art and I'm just awestruck, I'm struck by the wonder, it stands on its own, or a resonant work of art where the art resonates with me, I see it, I read something into it, I get an impression from it, I read something about it, it references other things, and it has this idea of building a network of relations and resonances. And so if the Sublime was sort of engaged with through this idea of wonder, then the hyperobject may well be a more appropriate response to it, is this idea of resonance, developing a network of different relations. And so there's artists that are currently kind of doing this already. Now, not necessarily in relation to the maritime, but if we think about Katie Patterson, she got this, delicate little branch here. Silva. It's just a little sculpture of a branch, but if you look closely at it and you read about it, you see that it's a cast sort of, it's actually cast out of the ashes of 10,000 different individual species of tree. So again, it's this simple object, but the material aspect of it, the material reality of it actually references this vast web of of trees, of forestry, of this hyper object of the forest, and it brings about these ideas of the anthropocene, global warming, deforestation, and it's got builds this huge resonant network of references and ideas. And so as an artist, thinking about using this hyper objective framework to engage with ideas of the maritime, or any ideas associated with this anthropocene, this geological epoch that we find ourselves in now, as this sort of inverted sublime, and it's, ultimately, every time gets the kind of the framework it deserves, right? So, in the Romantic era, you have the Sublime as this framework, and now in this era of the Anthropocene, we have the hyperobject. And if the Sublime is image-based, then the hyperobject, I'm claiming anyway that it should be a material response. Again, you've got Alefer Eliasson. You've got no image here as such, but he's literally brought blocks of ice from Greenland and landed them down in the center of Paris, and he's having people just watch as they melt and interact with them. It's all about the material, the actual material that it is, and confronting people with that. And again, you're building these networks of resonances, and you're referencing other things with it, and it's the material that brings it all together. Yeah, so this is my final slide here, but basically just for me then moving forward, so what now? It's this idea of developing this idea of the hyperobject as the inverted sort of mirror of the sublime, and the current framework, and materiality as the evidence of that, and then using a practice-based method to experiment with that, and that'll throw up more ideas in a very open-ended sort of epistemology, I suppose. So yeah, so that's me, that's the talk. Thanks very much, everyone, for listening, and I've got some contact details here if you kind of want to contact me at any point, or if any of this is resonant with you. But yeah, I'll throw it back to Catherine now, I guess. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So I'll stop recording in a second and invite you all to contribute your questions and thoughts. I know I'll be asking things about Ken calling Sublime in the middle of the Barbie movie, as well as some Brecht and Adorno, I think. So thank you so much for your talk, and we are stopping recording.